Okay, I think we're going to get started. Appreciate your patience. Thank you for joining us for this issue investigation about the Port Wentworth Data Center Ordinance. As many of you are aware, this has popped up on our radar, probably as well as yours. That's why you're here, and so we're hopeful to share more with you today. So the agenda for today, as you can see here, is we'll welcome you all. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. OHM issue investigations seek to take a deep dive about environmental issues that are popping up around the coast and provide people that are attending with more information and a forum for asking questions. So thank you for joining us. I will introduce our presenters in just a second. They are staff from 100 Miles who are very invested in this issue. We'll give a broad data center overview. Then we'll talk specifically about the Port Wentworth data center ordinance overview. We'll talk about what's going on, kind of the general timeline. We'll provide some conclusions. We'll give you an action availability, talk about the timeline of upcoming meetings and sessions, as well as given that Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, like I said, feel free to use that Q&A function on the built-in to Zoom, or if you're joining us on Facebook, please drop a question in the comment section and I'll be sure to be checking that comment section throughout. So without further ado, I'm Eric Swanson. I work as the Advocacy Education Coordinator for 100 Miles. That's why I'm here today. And I'm here today as kind of a host and as someone who is providing a little bit of facilitation, but definitely not the expert in the room. When we talk about experts and our staff, we definitely talk about Hannah. She's our coastal planning strategist. There we go. And she is really, really wonderful with community planning and figuring out how these data centers are going to have impacts and what best practices are, as well as Dr. Jeff Beauvais, who is our North Coast advocate and interfaces directly with kind of all of the things going on in Chatham County, which includes Port Wentworth. So without any further ado, because we are going to get through a lot of information here, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff, I believe. So, Jeff, you can feel free to go and I'll advance your slides.
Actually me.
Oh,
Sorry,
I'm sorry.
Eric.
It is Hannah. Hannah started. That's my bad. Apologies,
That's
Hannah.
okay. No, thank you so much, Eric, for that introduction. I'm just gonna kind of touch on some really foundational things about what data centers are, and kind of how zoning and land use matters when we're talking about data centers. I did just want to kind of throw it out there that data centers and their operational information is kind of limited to the public. So a lot of the information we have about data centers is kind of just constantly still growing. It has been a very the Atlanta region in particular is one of the fastest growing markets for data centers in the world. We don't have any on Georgia's coast just yet, but there has been a lot of interest in developing a data center market as out here as the Atlanta market expands. Um, and so that kind of just brings us to what are data centers, and they are these large, typically windowless warehouses that store very large computers and servers, and those computers hold the data that makes up things like AI or the cloud. And corporations, tech corporations in particular, rely on data centers to be able to provide the information for them to provide us with tech services. So if you think of like Microsoft or Google, they will have data centers all over the world that provide the resources for their work. And these computers in these data centers have to be kept in very specific conditions. Temperature is one of the most notable ones. They tend to be in the low to mid 70s temperature wise. And they achieve that by using large amounts of water to cool the air around the server rack. So when we talk about the impacts of data servers, that's the reason, or of data centers, that's the reason. They utilize and rely on large amounts of resources to be able to maintain kind of a equilibrium condition for these computers. And one of the most common questions I get is why are communities interested in allowing developers to build data centers in the first place? And usually what gets brought up, especially by our local governments or our development authorities who are trying to attract data centers, is that they increase the tax revenue for the city or county that they're in. There have been some research that some of our partners at the Southern Environmental Law Center and other partners have put out that said that tax revenue really doesn't, make out great, especially compared to the tax breaks that we are giving them to attract the data centers. But a lot of that research is kind of still coming to a head. So, and then there's also the potential to attract other tech companies when you already have all of this data center infrastructure built out. You can, oh, and one of the things that we'll also say a lot is that, people who are trying to advocate for data centers in their communities is that they bring jobs. That is actually kind of a myth. Square footage wise, they have a relatively small job creation. So they'll have like 30 to 50 employees in like an average data center. And they don't always tend to be local employees, local talent. They'll usually have to bring in specialized talent from other places to be able to run these data centers. But most importantly, what are the impacts that these data centers have on our communities? And one of the biggest ones that people will talk about is water consumption. So a large data center can use up to 200 million gallons of water annually. And that's equivalent to about 2,000 homes. And our communities, especially our North Coast communities, may not have those water resources readily available to support this. Another is significant energy use. 80% of Georgia Power's projected increased energy demands over the next decade is for data centers. And then they're also just kind of bad neighbors, right? So they can, like a lot of industrial industries, have noise pollution because of their such significant energy demand. They can bring grid outages to the area. Light pollution from any sort of generators or anything else that the industrial use would cause, and then the strains on resources during natural disasters. So if we're concerned about, hurricanes or extreme heat, there would be concerns over like how are we prioritizing where resources are going when data centers really cannot have system failure to support what their like actual job is, right? To support these tech companies. Also, as part of that noise pollution, so they can tend to have these large generators on site if they do have those energy failures, and they can cause pretty significant sleep disturbances, which everyone knows that sleep is such a significant aspect of our health and quality of life, which can lead to heart issues and anxiety. It's also not only bad for our human health, but bad for our wildlife health. Just something to think about. They tend to have these really annoying hums that a lot of people report as significantly problematic. So you can go to the next slide, Eric, thank you. So what do our data centers have to do with zoning, which is kind of what we're here to talk about today, right? Is Port Wentworth specific zoning ordinance. But zoning is how we decide what gets built where. Every property in the city is assigned a district which identifies how that property can be used, how big those buildings can be, any sort of requirements for the processes that developers have to use or have to follow to build something on those properties, right? So for this zoning ordinance, a zoning ordinance can add requirements for data centers that make them better neighbors to our communities and lessen some of those environmental and human health impacts that we talked about previously. A great example of this is actually DeKalb County, Georgia. They currently have a moratorium on data centers being developed in their communities, as they have been working very hard on a data center ordinance that fits the concerns of their planning staff, concerns of their elected officials, but most importantly, fits the concerns or addresses the concerns of their community members. So they have done a pretty rigorous community engagement campaign for this data center ordinance that allows people to give it a lot of feedback. And they released their most updated draft on December 3rd, which has had some really great requirements in the ordinance for any new data centers that are going in. One of the biggest ones that I recommend and is seen in that DeKalb County data center ordinance is identifying the 4 different sizes of data centers. So if we're talking about one that might be the size of like a typical office building, up to one that is campus size, like maybe the size of what we would consider like, a college campus or a tech campus for a corporation, things like that. Those require significantly different resources, right? So, they're not all created equal. And so recognizing that within the ordinance to be able to protect against maybe larger data centers, requiring a closed loop water cooling system. Like I mentioned, they use a ton of water. And so requiring them to reuse some of that water is pretty significant. And that does come with some drawbacks, right? So that would increase the energy demand to be able to have that closed loop system. But when we're talking about the North Coast, you have to weigh out what the most important resources are. And for the North Coast, that would be water. But I'll pass it over to Jeff to talk more about the specific case for Port Wentworth and what they've got going on and what you can do to engage in it.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks, Eric, and thanks everybody who's listening right now or who will watch this recording and listen in the next few days. So I'm going to talk specifically about Port Wentworth because that's really what we're focusing on. As Hannah mentioned, information about data centers, a lot of that research is still coming out and ongoing. This issue has really popped up recently as a phenomenon because of the explosion of AI and things like large language models, which power ChatGPT and these other things you've probably heard about in the news. That's why this is really exploding right now. And we still don't know a lot of stuff. And what we do know, quite frankly, a lot of times it has to sort of be pried from these corporations that bury this information in really, really dense technical reports. But that said, we do know enough to know what the things we need to be asking for in a good local law or state law are. So let's talk about what's happening in Port Wentworth specifically. So first, I'm going to talk about what the ordinance specifically does. And fundamentally, what it will do is allow data centers as a by right use in industrially zoned land in Port Wentworth. And what a by right use means is that basically a data center could be built without any additional review or a special required additional process from the Planning Commission in Port Wentworth or the Port Wentworth City Council. So it's sort of the easiest path by which you could build a data center in the city. Eric, can you advance, please? Now, the ordinance does have a few requirements that someone who would be applying to the city to build a data center would have to meet. Most of those requirements are focused or about disclosing information during the application process. So, one of the first requirements is that an applicant would have to tell the city, what is the height of the building and the surrounding fence that they're going to put up. The other element would be that if the applicant for a data center would have to tell the city where they're going to locate their utility connection. So where they're going to locate their electricity, their water intake, and then their wastewater discharge. And they would have to also provide confirmation from the utility provider, so from Georgia Power or from the city of Savannah with regards to water, that that utility provider is going to provide those resources and services to them. And then lastly, they also have to disclose the cooling system that they're going to be using. And as Hannah said, that cooling system is really, really important because that is where a lot of the water and electricity needs from the data centers come from. And then the only meaningful restriction that this ordinance would place on data centers is that they have to be at least 500 feet from any residential properties. And that's a 500-foot setback. So that's basically just you have to be 500 feet from any homes or 300 feet if there's a major road separating that data center and the homes. And a setback is very different than a buffer, or even better, a vegetative buffer, right? A vegetative buffer means that there has to be trees, there has to be some kind of vegetation between, the data center and the homes. And that's really important because it, not only provides for better, abatement and attenuation of the noise that these things put out, it also provides some visual screening so you don't have to look at a big ugly warehouse. And it, potentially provides more space for wildlife corridors. So just be aware of that a setback is just referring to a distance. It doesn't say anything about what's happening in that distance. So can you advance, please, Eric? So yes. And it also bans some types of siding for the building. These are mostly really ugly exterior sidings like, corrugated metals, raw cinder block, that sorts of things that, quite frankly, are sort of bare minimums in terms of controlling the visual design of what can be really massive buildings. Next slide, please, Eric. And so what are our concerns, as 100 miles about this? First, this is a really short ordinance that doesn't do enough to address all of the issues we already know about data centers. And keep in mind, what I just talked about is an updated version of this ordinance. The original version didn't have any of those minor requirements. All it did was allow data centers on industrial land. And so while what they currently have is an improvement on the original proposal, it's a pretty minor improvement. And that is because, first and foremost, allowing data centers as a by right use instead of a special use isn't a particularly good idea. And what a special use is that it's basically an additional process that an applicant has to go to or through in order to build something. So that gives the Planning Commission and the City Council in Port Wentworth more authority to review these things and make additional requirements and asks of a potential developer. So that's the first sort of issue that there is. Next, Eric, please. Another major concern, as Hannah mentioned, is that this ordinance treats all data centers the same. As she explained, a data center is a really generic term, and there's a world of difference between a small data center that, say, serves a local company, like, let's say, Armstrong, or I guess Georgia Southern University at Armstrong. They have what you might consider a data center on campus to house their internal data, their internal email systems, those sorts of things. That is a relatively small, thing that isn't, consuming large amounts of resources. And so that's probably not something we need to be concerned about. What we need to be concerned about are what are called these hyperscale data centers, things that companies like Google, Amazon Web Services, and Microsoft are building. Those things can be hundreds of thousands, upwards of 1 million square feet. And that is where the real concerns and the energy and the water usage and all the quality of life impacts come from. So any good ordinance should classify data centers by their size and their use, because not all data centers are doing the same thing. and apply different standards to those small and those large operators. Next, please. And then our other concern about the specifics of the ordinance is that disclosure is not enough. All of those requirements I talked about on the last slide are just saying, hey, if you're a developer, you've got to tell us about what you're doing. But, what does that really achieve for the city? If a developer discloses they're using a really water-intensive cooling system, or they want to draw water from an imperiled water source, what does that achieve? Okay, the city will know about it, but without that special use permit requirement or additional conditions in the ordinance, the city has no authority to actually say, hey, we want you to use a different type of cooling system that requires less water, or actually, we want you to pull from a different water source because we need this one to provide drinking water to our residents. As written, the city would have no authority to do that. All they would know is that, hey, this developer wants to do something that's not great. We don't have any real power to stop that. So that's why these laws need to be stronger and require that applicants do robust studies and develop plans to mitigate their environmental and quality of life impacts. Next slide, please, Eric. And really, most importantly, I think our biggest concern and what should be the most important concern to a local government is how Port Wentworth has handled this, the process by which they've crafted this. The first thing is that a lot of other cities in Georgia, as Hannah mentioned, particularly in North Georgia and the Atlanta metro area, but also cities and counties throughout the US, areas of Texas, particularly Northern Virginia, just around the DC, Washington, DC area, they are already dealing with this. And the ordinance the city of Port Wentworth has provided doesn't show any evidence that they have really engaged with how other communities have handled this, right? Like, what are the best practices other communities and local governments have adopted to minimize these impacts? The next slide, or next point, please, Eric. And really the most important point that I want to hammer home is that this has been a really rushed process, and the city has not conducted any broad public engagement with the residents of Port Wentworth to incorporate their thoughts on data centers. And that's what a local government should do. It should reflect the will of the people who live in that very specific location, because they're going to be the ones who bear the brunt of any development. And the city has not done that. So that is a huge and probably the biggest concern for us. And to illustrate this rush time, or how rushed this process is, I want to just provide a timeline for y'all. So the first ever mention of this ordinance was at the November 20th City Council meeting. It was not on the agenda. This discussion of the ordinance was added right at the start of the meeting. So before November 20th, nobody in the public would have known Port Wentworth was considering this ordinance. Next, please. We then heard nothing from the city of Port Wentworth until last Friday, when they released this new version of the ordinance on the city website. Next slide, please, or next point. The Planning Commission met yesterday, and the City Council will meet on Thursday to discuss and potentially vote on this ordinance. You can click twice, Eric. And this means that we have gone 28 days from the time the public first heard about this to the ordinance possibly being passed. And we're running a little low on time, so I'm going to hurry up. But Eric, can you go to the next slide, please? I want to take a moment to discuss the two steps at the end there, because this is where a lot of specifics about local government matter and where I find a lot of people have questions. The Planning Commission is made up of 9 people. They met yesterday. 4 of those are city employees, 5 are residents of Port Wentworth. These are appointed, they are not elected officials. And the Planning Commission, next point please, Eric, provides advice about zoning to the City Council. They only provide advice. So they vote on recommendations they're going to give to the council, but those votes are not a final decision or legally binding. Next, please, Eric. And yesterday, they unanimously voted to recommend denial of the ordinance. So that's really good news. And it's a particularly good news because a lot of people showed up. Next point, please, Eric. And they made their voices heard, and by their presence, they made the Planning Commission know. And your presence and your voice really matters here because these commissions are used to nobody being there. I have been in these commission meetings where I'm literally the only person other than people with business before the commission doing there. And so to have about 25 to 30 people there yesterday was a real shock, and it's really powerful. So your presence and your voice really matters. And that is important because, next slide, please, Eric. On Thursday, the city council is going to hear this, and they are going to potentially vote on what to do about this ordinance. And this is where you can directly talk to your elected officials and let them know, what your perspective on data centers are. And again, you can click through, Eric. I want to really emphasize here that showing up matters. And this is something that you can do to influence what is happening in Port Wentworth. It is not hopeless. The government is not just going to do what they want to do. If you show up and you make it clear what you want, they will, hopefully listen. And on top of getting a unanimous vote not to do this from the Planning Commission, on top of the incoming mayor speaking against this ordinance at the meeting yesterday, and on top of having a packed room on Thursday night, that would be really hard for the city council to cram this through after only 28 days of consideration. So please show up Thursday. And let your voice be heard. So I'm going to pass off to Eric to finish us off here.
Thank you, Jeff. So just some quick guidance from OHM on how you might interact with the process. They will have an opportunity to do a 3-minute comment. We're going to remember our 4 C's when we're doing these comments. We're going to be courteous, we're going to be clear, we're going to be concise, and we're going to be complete. We have a 3-minute guidance worksheet on how to give suggestions about how to structure your comment that will be in that follow-up email that we mentioned at the start. So be looking for that resource as well as some really wonderful resource Jeff has made up about some background and some guidance on the specific points of what this ordinance could do if it was allowed to be voted on and passed. So that's the basic guidance. Remember your 4 C's when you're talking to any person in a government office: courteous, clear, concise, and complete. And then the big ones is, just telling who you are and how you're connected to the issue. So identifying yourself and ingratiating, helping them understand who you are and why you care about the issue. You're going to state your ask if you're in support or against. You're going to explain your connection. Maybe you live in an area that is seeing a lot of industrial development and you don't want that development to continue in your backyard. You can personalize the ask by talking about how it might directly impact you, either through traffic concerns, noise concerns, so on and so forth. Do a summary at the end and close by providing thanks. We always remember that these are people we're talking to as well. So that commenting opportunity that we talked about happens at the Port Wentworth City Council meeting, which is Thursday, December 18th, begins at 7 p.m. If you want to give comment before the ordinance is talked about, you would actually have to enter your name. So you would have to get there early and sign up prior to the start of the meeting. If you don't get there, though, before that, you can have the second opportunity once the ordinance has been presented and read. Then the mayor will open up the floor to public comment and you can approach the podium to speak. Again, those are both 3 minutes long. You are time bound, so you have to make sure you get your message out. It's always good to help by really practicing in advance to make sure you get all the things said that you want to, or cut things that would take it too long because 3 minutes is pretty intensely enforced. Um, let's see. I'm gonna offer this as a point of contact to take a screenshot or let you all know that this is me and this is how to reach out to me. We're a small team at OHM. There's actually like 20% of our team in this call right now, but as a small team, we are able to offer support. You know me. Please reach out if you have any questions. In that follow-up email, we'll also have all of our contact information if you'd like more advice on how to provide guidance on those comments or any suggestions about what you might want to say during that meeting. Again, call, email, or text in regard to that. We're going to open it up to questions. I have one from Facebook that said someone mentioned that certain noise levels that can be expected from data centers. Do you have information about that and how it would affect residents? So, any specific noise level information, possibly that's Hannah might know?
Yeah, so the noise is one of those things that has tended to vary from different data centers based off who they're owned by, how large they are, what type of data they service. And it doesn't seem to be consistent, right? There have been reports, I believe, in the Memphis area, particularly for the generators that are used quite often to support keeping energy flowing into the data centers, that they tend to have this really disorienting hum and noise to them that has like made dogs' hair stand on end and has been a point of contention for people. So from what I understand, most of the noise concerns comes from either turbines or generators that they have on property.
Yeah, and as far as specific resources that you can, cite and point to and read more, this issue came up really rapidly, so we're still developing, some of those resources and those repositories,
Mm-hmm.
documents with links you can find. A lot of this, frankly, there's sort of the academic literature, university professors investigating this, and frankly, a lot of those things are behind paywalls and they're hard to access. Even for us, we have to ask friends who we know from universities to get some of those studies for us so we can read them and learn. But a lot of the reporting is really just good news and local reporting. And this is also where I want to emphasize why the rules matter, because a lot of the reason why it's hard to give like certainty and clear answers on these things is because local governments aren't requiring things like a noise impact study as a condition, or noise monitoring. They could require that these companies put up decibel meters along the fence line of their companies, and we could have actual real good data about this. So that's just something to think about of why these ordinances really matter too, because they could be a source of this information for us, instead of trying to piecemeal all of this stuff together from different sources that are trying to piece it together from the data that they can gather. So yeah, we will. If you attend the meeting Thursday, we'll have some fact sheets and things that do point to resources there, and I think we can share them along with the recording of this webinar, which you will get to your email after it's completed.
Yeah, I'll make sure to include those resources in the email in PDF form, as well as the presentation and a recording of the presentation with our audio. Another question coming in from the Q&A is Virginia asked, there are millions of square feet of warehouse currently available with a new campus of 10 million being built. What can we add to the ordinance to prevent conversion of these warehouse to data centers? So existing warehousing being converted to data centers. No, Jeff, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, I'm kind of sorry. I'm kind of
Sure.
still thinking about that one. I wouldn't be surprised. I just will say that I wouldn't be surprised if that was something that um, Port Wentworth went after as kind of like a reuse possibility, as maybe they're seeing the interest in those warehousing properties start to dwindle. Um, I think it would be a very interesting conversation over if that would be the best use for them, or I don't know. The answer right now, Virginia, is I'm not 100% sure. I think that that is a very important question to bring up, though. Jeff, you might have some better feedback on that.
Yeah, without speculating too much, I would also, that would be a leading hypothesis of mine from, sorry to use my academic talk, but that is what I would, if I had to make an educated guess, that is what I think is sort of um, the
The interest there.
reading between the lines. That's the
Yeah.
interest in this in Port Wentworth. And in terms of what specifically they could include, um, I would I would say I would have to learn more in terms of the specifics of how do you prevent conversion of the warehouses, uh, the currently built warehouses to data centers. I mean, any data center ordinance would presumably apply to retrofitting a building
Yeah.
to become a data center. So I don't know if you need a specific
One of
part of the
the
ordinance related
one
to
of the
that.
recommendations I would make would be for limiting where data centers could be an allowable use based off of already readily available infrastructure. So, yes, those warehouses will already have transmission lines, but it's unlikely that they'll have ones that would be able to support the energy needs that data centers would need. Um, yeah, that would be one limiting tool I could see would be requiring already available infrastructure.
Awesome. I'll follow up with kind of a last question, unless there is more, kind of doing a last call for questions from anyone in the Zoom or on Facebook. But the last question I'd like to try to get to is, we are in Chatham County, Georgia. We are coastal county. We are part of an area that gets hit sometimes by hurricanes. If either of you could speak specifically to the question around how do how does a data center deal with the possibility of a power outage? What does that mean broadly for the residents of the area?
Mhm.
How does that affect our infrastructure locally? If we are without power for a long period of time or water.
Um, so a data center going dark is a really big deal for them, right? That kind of just negates the purpose if they're not able to provide services to their whoever owns the data center. Um, so when that happens, they, like I was talking about earlier, they do use emergency generators. These are typically fossil fuel uh, ran. So there's air pollution concerns of that, noise pollution concerns. But really, for the purpose of a hurricane in particular, I would be very concerned over how our service providers, so Georgia Power, whoever, or I believe that's the main service provider for Port Wentworth. Down here in the South Coast, we also have Okefenokee Power. So, but how those service providers prioritize power restoration after a hurricane would, and this is obviously speculation, but would a data center take precedent over residences or other, or maybe like essential service providers? Those would be some very serious concerns I would have. And it really does beg the question, like, would it be worth it to build data centers in these areas that are so sensitive to hurricane impacts?
Yeah, I will second that. In that, there are different tiers of data centers, and one of the ways they're classified is their downtime or how long
Mm-hmm.
per year they are allowed to not be operational. And I think like the highest tier of data center is only allowed to be not operational for like 30 minutes out of an entire year. So
Yeah.
just imagine that 30 minutes out of the entire year, it's not allowed to be operating, which is why they have all of these redundancies built in, like backup generators. And even if nothing happens, hurricanes are spotty. Sometimes we go years without having any impacts from them, but they still have to run and maintain those generators. So even if a hurricane's not happening, they're running those
Mm-hmm.
generators just to maintain them. Um, and so that's a concern. But I would really second Hannah's point is that I don't know, what Georgia Power's prioritization of restoring um, electricity services. I don't know what the city of Savannah's would be, and how that for water. Um, I'm not sure if they've developed rules around this. They're probably in the process of developing those rules. But a lot of the issue we have as well is that the power sharing agreements between Georgia Power and these data center companies are, as from my understanding, considered trade secrets. And so they are not something that's particularly easy to get public data or information about. So that should be top of mind
Mhm.
for any data center being proposed in the coastal zone, anywhere from Savannah down to Camden County. We've got to think about that as a major issue.
And Jeff, I just want to add, I think that's why it's so important that we do have these ordinances that are for data centers, right? So this isn't, we want to have ordinances for this. It protects the city, it protects the county, it protects our residents. And it shows that there has been consideration into these processes. These ordinances just need to be stronger, have more community input, need to make these data centers good neighbors if we're going to allow them to build in our communities.
Yeah, and one final point on that is, I don't want people to perceive us as 100 miles as being trying to dictate what the terms of this are. I think we're trying to present suggestions of things that we have seen other communities adopt in order to protect themselves. And, we're happy to partner with communities anywhere, be it Port Wentworth all the way down through Camden County, to think about those things. But ultimately, this is why a local government doing good engagement with the public is so possible because important because people in communities are going to disagree. Some people are going to want a ban. Some people are going to want them. Some people are going to be somewhere in between. And good government would take those disagreements among the community. They would have a productive process like workshops and listening sessions in order to, try to work those out and come to a space where the community can agree on. And that might look different across the coast. And so that's what ultimately we really want Port Wentworth to do is to slow down, take a pause, and do a good job engaging the residents of Port Wentworth to craft something that they want.
Awesome. On that final note, I'm going to share again that OHM support. If you want to see that with my contact information, be expecting a follow-up email with this recording as well as some of those resources we mentioned before. The final thing I'll flash to is that Port Wentworth City Council meeting. Remember, it's this Thursday, December 18th at 7 p.m. Arrive a little bit early if you can, if you'd like to get your name into the register to speak for the first opportunity. And with that second opportunity, you can do that as soon as the mayor opens up the floor to public comment. So again, reach out. We are a resource. I am going to stop the share and let us all say goodbye. And thank you for joining us. And we hope you reach out for more information if you'd like.